The first time Gideon McCrae spoke to Louisa Bancroft, he told her she had parked her wagon on the wrong side of the road, and she told him that was the most words she had ever heard a man string together about nothing, and something inside his chest cracked open like a fault line after a long drought. Gideon McCrae had not always been a man of stone. There had been a time, long before the valley of Coldwater Creek had grown quiet and still, when he laughed at dinner tables and called out good morning to neighbors across fence lines and pressed wildflowers into the pages of books he meant to give to people he loved. That time felt so distant now that when he tried to reach for it in his memory, his fingers closed around air. 23 years had passed since Clara died, 23 years since the fever took her and their daughter in the same merciless week of August, and in all that time, Gideon McCrae had decided that kindness was a luxury he could no longer afford. Not because he was cruel by nature, but because every kind word he had ever spoken had been borrowed against a debt the world eventually collected in full, and he was not willing to go into debt again. He was 44 years old, lean and weathered the way fence posts get weathered in the Wyoming sun, with gray threading through his dark hair and deep lines carved at the corners of his eyes. He ran his cattle ranch, the Double C, alone. He hired 2 hands for roundup season, kept his horses fed and his fences mended, and he nodded at people in town because nodding required nothing from the inside of a man. Everybody in Coldwater Valley knew Gideon McCrae. They knew to give him room at the general store, to not attempt conversation at the feed and grain, to let him eat his meals at the far end of the counter at Edna's Diner without interruption. Children in the valley were told the story of old McCrae the way children in other places were told stories of thunderstorms, not to frighten them exactly, but to teach them that some forces of nature simply were what they were, and you gave them their sky. The valley itself was the kind of place that made Eastern painters weep. It sat in a wide bowl between 2 ridges of the Laramie Mountains, with Coldwater Creek running silver and cold through the middle of it. In the summer of 1882, the grass came in green and thick along the creek bottom, and the wild lupin spread purple across the higher meadows, and the sky was the color of something a person could not quite name, so purely blue that it almost looked false, like a watercolor someone had not bothered to temper. There were 11 ranches in the valley and the town of Coldwater Crossing, which had a church, a post office, a general store run by a man named Hector Baines, a blacksmith, a schoolhouse, and Edna's Diner, where Edna Marsh cooked the best biscuits in 3 counties and did not tolerate card playing on her premises. It was into this quiet that Louisa Bancroft arrived on a Thursday in late May, driving a mule-drawn wagon loaded with more books than furniture, with a brown canvas hat pulled low over her dark red hair, and a look on her face that was not quite determination and not quite fear, but something poised cleanly between the two. She was 31 years old, which in the parlance of 1882 Wyoming made her a curiosity all on its own. A woman of 31, unmarried, arriving alone to take up the position of schoolteacher at Coldwater Crossing's 1-room schoolhouse was the kind of event the valley would discuss for weeks. Louisa had known this before she arrived. She had come from Cincinnati, Ohio, where she had spent 6 years teaching at a private school for young women, and before that, she had spent 3 years helping her father run his print shop after her mother died. She was not a woman who had been sheltered from difficulty. She was, in fact, a woman who had learned to carry difficulty the way a good mule carries a load, with steady legs and no unnecessary complaint. The post that brought her to Coldwater Crossing had been advertised in the Cincinnati Enquirer in March of 1882. She had read it on a Tuesday morning, sitting at her father's kitchen table with a cup of coffee going cold beside her, and she had felt something lift in her chest like a bird taking wing. She had written to the school board of Coldwater Crossing that same day, and 3 weeks later she had their letter of acceptance, and 3 weeks after that She had packed everything she owned into a wagon and pointed herself west. Her father had cried. Her two younger sisters had cried. Her friend Margaret had cried and called her insane, and then cried again, and said she thought it was probably the bravest thing a person could do. Louisa had not cried, because she had learned long ago that some choices required you to move before the full weight of them arrived, and so she had moved. She arrived in Coldwater Crossing on a Thursday, as has been said, and the first person she encountered was Gideon McCrae, which was the kind of luck that could be read in either direction depending on how a person was inclined. She had pulled her wagon to the side of the main road to consult the hand-drawn map the school board chairman, a man named Robert Dutton, had sent her, and she had apparently stopped in a spot that Gideon McCrae required for the passage of his supply wagon, because he pulled up behind her and waited exactly 30 seconds before speaking. "You are on the wrong side of the road," he said. His voice was the kind of voice that did not ask anything of you. It simply stated things the way a plumb line states vertical. Louisa looked up from her map. She looked at him, this tall, weather-darkened man in a gray duster and a black hat, and she took his measure in the way she had learned to take people's measure quickly, as a person who had spent years managing rooms full of young women who were all much smarter than they let on. "I am on the only side of the road that has enough room for my wagon to stop," she said. "If there are two sides to this road, the other side is occupied by that ditch." Gideon looked at the ditch. He looked back at her. He said nothing. "I am Louisa Bancroft," she said. "I am the new schoolteacher. Can you tell me which direction leads to the Dutton property?" "That is where I have been arranged to board while the school cottage is being made ready." He pointed west without a word. "Thank you," she said, very pleasantly, and gathered her reins and drove on. And that, the valley would later agree, was where the whole extraordinary business began. Louisa moved into the spare room at Robert and Harriet Dutton's ranch house, a tidy, whitewashed room with a window that looked out at the creek, and she spent her first week in Coldwater Crossing making herself useful and making herself known. She was, by nature, a person who found people interesting, and the valley was full of people worth finding interesting. She learned that Harriet Dutton made her own soap and had an opinion about everything, which Louisa respected enormously. She learned that Hector Baines at the general store kept a secret collection of dime novels behind the counter, which he loaned out for 2 cents a week, and she borrowed 3 immediately. She learned that the blacksmith, a man named Joseph Cross, had come from Bohemia 15 years ago and spoke with an accent thick as river mud and laughed at everything including his own jokes. She learned that Edna Marsh at the diner was the social center of the entire valley, that everything worth knowing passed through Edna's at some point. And she learned, in the way that a person cannot help learning the sharp edge of a thing that is simply part of a landscape, that Gideon McCrae was a subject of particular interest in the valley. Not of gossip exactly, but of a kind of careful, reverent attention that the valley paid to something it did not fully understand and did not want to disturb. He was not always like that, Harriet Dutton told her the second evening at supper when Louisa asked about him in what she hoped was a casual way. He had a wife, Clara, she was lovely, and a daughter not a year old. Fever took them both in '89, well no, it would have been '59. He was your age or so when it happened. Maybe a year younger. Louisa did the arithmetic quietly. 23 years. He never remarried, she said. He never even looked, Harriet said. He just put his head down and worked that ranch, and somewhere along the way he stopped talking much and stopped looking people in the eye, and I think the valley just decided that was the arrangement and left him to it. Robert Dutton, who was a large, comfortable man with a gray beard and a practical view of most things, said, "He is a fine rancher and an honest man, and he keeps himself to himself. There are worse ways to live." "There are better ones, too," Harriet said, and passed the cornbread. Louisa thought about that and said nothing, which was a skill she had developed over years of teaching, the skill of receiving information and simply holding it for a while before deciding what to do with it. The school term began on the second Monday of June, which gave Louisa 2 weeks to prepare. She walked the length of the valley in that time, which was how she encountered Gideon McCrae for the second time. She had gone up along the creek to see where the cottonwoods grew thickest, because she had a plan to take the children there for a nature study lesson, and she wanted to know the ground before she took them anywhere. She was standing on a flat rock above the water, looking at a beaver dam with considerable professional interest, when she heard a horse, and turned to find Gideon McCrae watching her from about 50 yards away with an expression that was not quite surprise, but was close to it. He had apparently been riding along the ridge above the creek, and had come down to water his horse at a spot that happened to be this spot, which happened to be the spot where she had chosen to stand. "The beaver dam is new this spring," she called to him, because she had learned in Cincinnati that the best way to deal with a person who seemed inclined towards silence was to simply include them in the conversation and let them decide their own level of participation. Gideon McCrae walked his horse the rest of the way down to the water and let the animal drink. He glanced at the dam. "They put one up every spring," he said. "Flood the lower pasture. Do you remove it?" He looked at her as if the question was unexpected. "I move it back far enough that the water runs around it. They build it again." He paused. "We have an arrangement." Louisa felt something warm in her chest at that, because it was the most human thing she had heard him say, and she had the sense that he had not intended it to be. She looked back at the dam. "I am planning to bring the schoolchildren here," she said, "for a nature lesson. The creek is clean and the bank is stable. I would want to make sure the land is not your property first." "It is mine from the fence line to the ridge," he said. "The school board has always had permission to use the creek bank." "Then I will use it," she said. "Thank you, Mr. McCrae." He turned his horse and was gone before she could say anything else, and she stood watching the way the horse moved through the tall grass, and thought that Gideon McCrae moved through the world the way the creek moved through the valley, necessary and constant, and somehow entirely alone. The school term opened with 21 children in attendance, ranging from 6 years old to 14. Louisa had taught every kind of student that the world could produce, the reluctant and the eager, the sharp-minded and the slow, the ones who were angry and the ones who were frightened, and she greeted all 21 of them on that first morning with the same plain warmth she gave everything, which was to say she greeted them the way good light greets a room, by simply being present and letting everything else arrange itself around that. By the end of the first week, she had won most of them. By the end of the second, she had won all of them, including a boy named Tommy Hester, who had apparently been the bane of the previous teacher's existence, a 12-year-old with a knife-sharp mind, and absolutely no inclination to use it for anything the school suggested. Louisa gave Tommy a copy of a book on natural history that she had brought from Cincinnati, and told him she expected a written report on whatever section interested him most, and he looked at her with those suspicious bright eyes and took the book without a word, and the following week returned it with 6 pages of careful, passionate writing about river systems. She gave him another book. He wrote 8 pages. By July, Tommy Hester was the most reliable student in the school and Louisa's most fervent defender, which mattered because the valley was still watching her carefully, still deciding. The school cottage was ready by the end of June, and Louisa moved from the Dutton house to her own small 2-room dwelling on the edge of town. With a front porch that looked at the mountains and a kitchen garden, she began immediately, because she believed that a person without a garden was a person without roots, and she intended to put down roots in Coldwater Valley. It was the garden that brought Gideon McCrae to her door for the first time. He arrived on a Saturday morning in early July, riding his dark bay horse, and he dismounted at her gate and stood there with his hat in his hands in a posture that looked, she thought, like a man doing something against his own better judgment. She was on her knees in the garden, planting beans, and she looked up at him and waited. "Your fence post," he said, and nodded at the corner of her garden fence, where the wood had indeed rotted at the base and was listing badly toward the road. "It will fall by next week." She looked at it. "I noticed that," she said. "I was going to ask Hector Baines if he knew anyone who could fix it." "I can fix it," Gideon said. She looked at him. He looked at the fence post. "That is very kind of you," she said. Something crossed his face at the word kind, something she could not quite read, a flinch or a recoil, as if the word had landed unexpectedly. He set his jaw and said, "I have the tools, it is no difficulty." She stood up from the garden and dusted the soil from her hands and said, "Then I thank you for the offer. Would you like coffee when you are done? I have a pot on." He said nothing for a long moment. Then, "All right." She went inside to see to the coffee, and she listened to the sound of him working in the garden, the solid rhythm of digging and tamping, and the clang of tools, and there was something in that ordinary domestic sound that made her stand at the kitchen window and feel something she was not yet ready to name. He came to the back door when he was done. She handed him a cup of coffee through the doorway, and they stood on either side of the threshold and drank their coffee and did not say much of anything. But the silence between them was different from the silence of two people who have nothing to say. It was the silence of two people standing at the edge of something large and deciding whether to look down. "How long have you had the ranch?" she asked at last. "My father bought the land in '61, he said. "I built the house in '64. "You built it yourself?" "With 2 men I hired out of Cheyenne." A pause. Clara chose where to put the windows. She heard the way his voice changed on the name, so slightly that a person not paying attention would have missed it entirely, but Louisa was always paying attention. "She had good taste," she said carefully. "The valley is beautiful from all directions." He looked out at the mountains. "Yes," he said, "it is." He left not long after, taking his horse back up the road toward the double C, and Louisa stood on her porch and watched him go and thought about a man who had carried grief so long it had become the shape of him. And she thought about what it might mean to offer that man something soft without making him feel diminished by it. July deepened into its full heat, and the valley baked golden, and the creek ran lower, and Louisa taught her 21 students, and tended her garden, and became, week by week, simply part of Coldwater Crossing, the way all necessary things eventually become simply part of the place they belong to. She ate at Edna's diner on Tuesday nights and borrowed dime novels from Hector Baines, and attended Sunday services at the small white church where the Reverend Aldous Price preached sermons that were mercifully short and, she thought, genuinely kind in their view of humanity. Gideon McCrae did not attend church. He did attend the town meeting in late July, when there was a dispute about the water rights on the South Fork of the creek, which involved his ranch and the ranch belonging to a man named Dale Osgood, who was large and loud, and inclined to believe that raising your voice was a substitute for having a point. Louisa attended the town meeting because she had been invited by Robert Dutton, who thought it would help her understand how the valley settled its affairs. She sat in the back of the schoolhouse, which had been borrowed for the occasion, and she watched Gideon McCrae stand up in the middle of the argument between Dale Osgood and Robert Dutton and the water commissioner from Cheyenne, and she watched him speak in that quiet, plumb-line voice about the actual legal precedent of the water rights claim, which he appeared to have researched thoroughly, and she watched the room go quiet and listened to him, and she thought, there he is. There is the man under the stone. He noticed her on the way out. Their eyes met across the room, and his flickered with something she could not name, and he gave her a brief nod and walked out into the summer evening. The water rights were settled in his favor, which was the correct outcome. August came, and with it the valley's summer dance, which was held at the Dutton barn on the last Saturday of the month and was, as far as Louisa could tell, the social event of the year. Half the valley turned out. Joseph Cross played fiddle with a wild, joyful ferocity, and a young man named Pete Albright played guitar, and the dancing went on until midnight under lanterns strung from the rafters. Louisa wore her good blue dress, the one she had bought in Cincinnati 2 winters ago, and she danced with Robert Dutton and with a young school board member named Harry Cobb, who was married and nervous and danced well, and she danced with Joseph Cross during a waltz, which he conducted with enormous seriousness, and she was considering sitting down to catch her breath when she saw Gideon McCrae standing at the far edge of the barn near the open door. He had come. She had not expected that. He was holding a glass of cider and looking at the dancing the way a man looks at a fire from a safe distance, drawn and wary at once. He was wearing a white shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbow, and his dark hair was combed, and he looked, she thought, like a man who had made a considerable effort to attend something he was not sure he should have attended. She crossed the barn toward him without allowing herself to hesitate, because she had learned that hesitation was the enemy of good things. "You came," she said. "Dutton asked me," he said, as if that explained and concluded the matter. "Are you enjoying yourself?" He looked at the dancers. "It is a fine dance," he said, which she suspected was the most diplomatic thing he had said in years. "Will you dance?" she asked. The look he gave her was extraordinary. It was not quite alarm and not quite longing and not quite refusal. It was the look of a man standing at a river crossing, calculating the depth. "I have not danced in a long time," he said. "Then you are due," she said, and held out her hand. He looked at her hand. He looked at her face. He set his cider glass on the barrel beside him, and he took her hand, and they walked out to the floor where Joseph Cross happened at that very moment to swing into a slower waltz, as if the evening had arranged it deliberately. Gideon McCrae could dance. That was the surprise. He was stiff at first, careful, holding her at the full proper distance, but the muscle memory of it came back to him the way things do, quietly and then all at once, and he moved her through the waltz with a steadiness and quiet grace that made her catch her breath. "You are good at this," she said. "Clara liked dancing," he said, and then he stopped, the way a man stops when he has said something he did not intend to say. "I think that is a lovely thing to remember about someone," Louisa said quietly. He looked at her. For a long moment he simply looked at her, and she held his gaze without flinching, and something passed between them that was too fragile and too large to speak about directly. They danced the rest of the waltz in silence, and it was the finest silence she had ever kept. After that night, things shifted. Not dramatically, not in the ways that stories sometimes describe, with sudden declarations and overturned assumptions. It shifted the way the light shifts at the end of summer, perceptibly but gradually, in ways that you notice only when you compare the beginning to the present, and find that the distance between them is greater than you thought. Gideon began stopping by the school cottage in the mornings before school, on the days when he rode past on his way to town for supplies. At first, he simply tied his horse to the fence and brought things he thought she might need: a bundle of kindling because he had noticed her wood supply was low, a jar of honey from the hive he kept at the south end of his property, a sack of dried beans from his store, because the general store had been out the day before, and he had overheard her tell Harriet Dutton she needed them. He never stayed long, and he never said much. But he came, and she received each thing he brought with simple, direct thanks, never making it larger than it was, never turning it into something that would frighten him back into himself. She began leaving things for him in return. When she baked, which she did on Sunday afternoons because baking required a kind of attention that she found meditative and grounding, she set aside a portion on her porch with a cloth over it. She never told him it was there. But it was there when he passed, and it was gone the next time she looked, and she learned to count that as a kind of conversation. September came, and the aspens in the high country began to turn, and the air took on that particular sharpness of the Wyoming fall, clean and cold and carrying pine, and the whole valley began its preparations for winter with the focused energy of people who knew exactly what was coming and intended to be ready for it. One afternoon in mid-September, Louisa was walking back from the creek with 3 of her older students, who had been helping her collect rock and plant samples for a science lesson, when she came upon the scene of a disaster. A wagon had gone off the road at the bend above her cottage, had slid sideways into the drainage ditch and tipped on its side, spilling its load of lumber across the road. 2 horses stood in their harness looking bewildered, and standing beside the wagon, assessing the damage with the grim expression of a man calculating a loss, was Gideon McCrae. She sent the children ahead and came to stand beside him. "Are you hurt?" "No," he said. "Are the horses?" He examined them both with practiced hands. "No." He straightened. "Wheel came off the axle. I was going too fast at the bend." He said this without self-pity and without drama, a simple statement of fact and its consequence. "We can get this righted," she said. He looked at her. "You cannot lift this wagon." "No," she agreed, "but I can hold the horses and I can get help. Tommy Hester's father has a draft team. His farm is a quarter-mile back." She did not wait for his response. She walked back up the road to the Hester farm and explained the situation to Calvin Hester, who was a broad, practical man who took in the facts and said, "All right then," and hitched his draft team. And 15 minutes later they had the wagon back on the road, and the lumber reloaded with an efficiency that Louisa found satisfying. Gideon McCrae paid Calvin Hester for his time and trouble, and Calvin Hester clapped him on the shoulder in the way of men who have done a job together, and drove his team back up the road. And then it was just the two of them, Gideon and Louisa, standing in the road in the long slant of late afternoon light. "Thank you," he said. "You are welcome," she said. He turned his hat in his hands, a gesture she had come to recognize as his version of reaching for words. "You could have left me to figure it out," he said. "I could have," she agreed. But that seemed like a pointless use of the afternoon. Something shifted in his face. Not quite a smile, but the shape of one, the landscape of one, visible the way mountains are visible behind clouds, present even when not entirely seen. "I will be going," he said, "before the light goes." "Be careful at the bend," she said. He mounted his horse and he rode maybe 20 feet up the road, and then he stopped and turned back and he said, "My herd comes down from the summer pasture on Saturday. If you have no particular plans for the morning, it is something to see." He said it quickly, the way a man says a thing that he has decided to say before he can decide not to, and his expression in the aftermath was braced, as if for a blow. "Then I will come," she said simply. He nodded, turned, and rode. She stood in the road for a moment longer than necessary, watching the dust settle, and she felt something bloom very quietly in her chest, something she did not examine too closely because she knew that examined too early, it would embarrass itself. She came on Saturday morning before the light was fully up, because she had grown accustomed to early rising, and because she wanted to see the whole of it. She tied her horse, a gentle roan mare she had rented from the Dutton stable, to Gideon's fence and walked up to the ridge overlooking the high pasture, and she understood immediately why he had told her to come. The herd moved down through the morning light like a river, 200 head of cattle with their breath rising in white clouds, the sound of them a low, constant thunder, the cattle dogs working the edges with that absolute focused joy that cattle dogs carry in their bodies like a second nature. Gideon and his 2 hired hands, brothers named Walt and Ellis Brent, rode at the edges of the herd, and she watched him work, the way he moved his horse with his knees and hips without seeming to think about it, the easy authority of a man entirely at home in the thing he was doing. She stood on the ridge for 2 hours and watched, and when it was done and the herd was settled in the lower pasture, she came down and found Gideon watering his horse at the trough, and he looked up at her with a question in his eyes. "It is magnificent," she said. "Genuinely, I have never seen anything like it." "Most people in town have seen it," he said. "Most people in town did not grow up in Cincinnati," she said. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Come in and eat breakfast. Walt and Ellis are staying too." He said it plainly, without ceremony, as if feeding people who had been present at a morning's work was simply what was done, which in fact in the valley it was. She followed him into the house, which she had not been in before, and she saw the way it was kept, plain and clean and orderly, with a kind of spareness to it that was not bareness but rather economy. Every object present had a purpose and a place. But there were small things she noticed that told her the man who had built this house had not begun as a man of stone. a carved wooden frame around the front window, a quilt on the back of the parlor chair in a pattern she did not recognize but that was clearly old and clearly kept with care, a shelf of books, actual books, not many but chosen, she could tell, with attention. She helped Gideon fry bacon and slice bread, while Walt and Ellis Brent came in and washed at the pump and sat at the table talking easily about the roundup. And the four of them ate breakfast in the morning kitchen with the windows gold with early sun. And it was, Louisa thought, one of the finest meals she had eaten in a very long time. After, when the Brent brothers had gone and the dishes were done, she and Gideon sat on the porch with coffee and the morning. It was one of those Wyoming mornings that seems to have been made deliberately excessive, the mountains white-capped and sharp against the blue, the valley green and gold below, the creek catching light like it was being paid to. "Do you miss Cincinnati?" he asked. It was the first personal question he had ever directed at her, and she felt it land with a significance that she hoped did not show on her face. "I miss my father," she said. "I miss my sisters. I miss my friend Margaret, who thinks I have lost my mind and writes me letters that take 3 weeks to arrive and always say the same thing in new words." She looked at the mountains. "But I do not miss Cincinnati itself. I think I was ready to leave it long before I admitted that to myself." "What made you come here?" he asked. "Specifically here." She thought about it honestly. "The advertisement said the valley was beautiful," she said, "and that the school needed someone with experience. And I suppose that somewhere between those two things there was a version of a life that looked like something I wanted." She paused. "What does that sound like to you?" "It sounds," he said slowly, "like a person who knows what she wants." "I do," she said. "Generally speaking." She looked at him sidelong, and something in the morning light made her braver than she usually allowed herself to be. "And what did you want when you came here? When you first built this place?" He was quiet for a long time. She waited. "Everything," he said at last. "I wanted everything that a life could hold." He stared into his coffee cup. "A family. A place to belong to, work that mattered, people to come home to." He set the cup down. "I had all of it for 3 years." She did not fill the silence. She let it be what it was. "I am sorry," she said, "for what it cost you." He looked at her then, really looked at her the way he had looked at her during the waltz, with something unguarded moving behind his eyes. "You don't flinch," he said. "Most people flinch when they talk to me." "Why would I flinch?" she said. "Because I am not easy company." "You are honest company," she said. "That is considerably rarer." She stood up to go, gathering her jacket from the porch railing. "Thank you for the breakfast and for the invitation this morning. It was a privilege to see." "Louisa," he said. She turned. It was the first time he had used her given name. "Come again," he said. "If you want to." "I want to," she said. October arrived with cold mornings and brilliant afternoons, and the aspens turned the whole high country gold, and the air smelled of wood smoke and pine, and the kind of clarity that only comes when summer is finally done with itself. Louisa had settled entirely into her life in Coldwater Valley now. She knew every child in her school by heart, knew their particular difficulties and particular brilliances, knew which parents needed to be approached carefully and which could be spoken to plainly. She had become a friend to Harriet Dutton, and a valued customer at Edna's Diner, and a regular attendee at Reverend Price's services. The valley had accepted her the way valleys accept things, slowly and without ceremony but thoroughly. And she had become, in the careful and particular way that things grow when they are not forced, a person in Gideon McCrae's life. He rode past her cottage most mornings now, and he stopped most days, sometimes only long enough to pass a word or leave something on the porch, sometimes long enough for coffee. She visited the Double C on weekend mornings when the weather was good, and she learned the rhythms of the ranch the way she had learned the rhythms of her classroom, by paying attention until the pattern revealed itself. She knew when he was worried about the south fence and when he was satisfied with the herd's condition, and when the weather was turning before he said so, because she watched the way he looked at the sky. He had begun talking to her. Not effortlessly, not the way some men talk, as if speech costs them nothing. He talked to her the way a man talks when he has been silent so long that each word is a small recovery, careful and considered and real. And she received everything he said with the same plain attention she gave everything, which was what made it possible for him to keep going. He told her about his father, who had been a difficult man but a fair one, who had brought the family west from Pennsylvania when Gideon was 16, and had worked the land until his heart gave out in 1875. He told her about Clara, a little not all at once, but in the way that grief eventually makes itself available, piece by piece, when the person hearing it can be trusted to hold it carefully. He told her that Clara had been funny, genuinely funny, that she had made him laugh every single day, and that was one of the things he had missed most, the laughter. "You laughed tonight," Louisa told him one October evening when they were sitting by her fire after supper, because she had begun inviting him to supper on Friday evenings, and he had begun coming. He looked at her. "Did I? When I told you about Tommy Hester's report on river systems and how he drew his diagrams in your honor," she said, and she could see him remember it, and she could see the faint movement in his face that was his version of laughing, that private, barely visible warmth. "It is an absurd amount of detail," he said. "It is 12 pages of passion," she said. "I could not be prouder of that boy." "He reminds me of myself," Gideon said, and she looked at him with a kind of quiet wonder because he had just said something entirely unguarded, and she could see him register that and choose not to take it back. November brought the first real snow, and the valley went white and quiet, and the school was closed for a week when a second storm came hard on the heels of the first. Louisa spent those days reading and baking and reorganizing her lesson materials, and on the second day she found herself standing at her window looking at the snow-covered road and thinking about Gideon alone on that ranch in this silence, and feeling something that she no longer bothered pretending was something other than what it was. She was in love with him. She had been in love with him, she thought, since September. Possibly since the waltz. Possibly since the morning with the fence post, and the coffee and the way he had said we have an arrangement, talking about the beaver and his flooded pasture, as if the natural world were simply a neighbor he had reached an understanding with. She did not know what to do with this. Not because she was afraid of it, she had never been much afraid of her own interior. She was a person who looked at herself clearly. This was one of the things that made her good at her work, but because Gideon McCrae was a man whose barriers were load-bearing, and she did not know what would happen if they came down, and she cared too much about his well-being to risk it carelessly. She wrote to Margaret in Cincinnati. She did not explain everything, but she explained enough, and the letter she received back 3 weeks later said, in Margaret's particular voice, "A man who has been closed for 20 years is still a man with the same need to be loved as anyone else, and if he did not want to be reached, he would not keep riding past your house every morning. Go to it, Louisa." She folded the letter and put it in her Bible and thought about it for 4 more days. And then on the 5th day, Gideon came to her Friday supper, and she put the food on the table and sat down across from him, and she said, "I want to tell you something." He put his fork down and looked at her, and his expression was very still, which she had learned meant he was paying close attention. "I do not say this to pressure you," she said, "or to ask anything of you that you are not able to give. But I think honesty between two people who respect each other is important, and I respect you very much." She kept her eyes on his. "I love you, Gideon." The room was very quiet. The fire popped once. "I have," she continued, "for some time. And I am telling you because I think you deserve to know it, and also because you are a man who has spent a great deal of time being very careful about what things cost, and I want you to know that whatever this costs you to hear, it is freely given and there is no debt attached to it." He did not move. He sat there in the firelight with his hands flat on the table and his eyes on her face, and he looked, she thought, like a man who has just heard something in a language he used to know fluently but has not spoken in so long that it takes a moment to translate. "Louisa," he said. His voice was rough. "You do not need to say anything tonight," she said. "I simply wanted you to know." He looked at the fire, he looked at his hands, he looked at her. "I am a difficult man," he said. "You are an honest man," she said, "and a good one, and you have been very lonely for a very long time. I do not think difficult and loving are the same thing." He stood up from the table, and she thought for a moment that he was going to leave, but he did not leave. He came around the table and he stood in front of her, and she stood up from her chair, and they were very close together in the warm, small room, and he lifted his hand and put it against her cheek with a gentleness that made her breath catch in her throat, because it was the gentleness of a man who has been very careful with everything for a very long time, and is for this one moment deciding to put the carefulness down. "I have not been a kind man," he said, "for a long time. I am not sure I know how to be kind anymore." "You have been kind to me," she said. "Every morning, in every single thing you have left on my porch, in every word you have said to me. In every moment you chose to come back." He closed his eyes, he opened them again, and he said very quietly, "I think I have loved you since the day on the ridge when you watched my herd come down and did not once look at me like I needed to explain myself." "You do not need to explain yourself," she said. "No," he said. "With you I do not." He kissed her. It was careful and warm and entirely, completely real, the kind of kiss that happens between two people who have arrived at the same conclusion by different roads and are glad, very glad, to find themselves standing in the same place. They stood in her fire-lit cottage in the November snow, and the whole quiet valley held them in its dark and cold, and Louisa thought that she had been right about everything, right to come west, right to stand on the ridge that morning, right to say the things she had said. Harriet Dutton found out on Monday. She found out because she saw Gideon's horse at Louisa's gate at 7 in the morning, which was 45 minutes earlier than he usually stopped. And Harriet Dutton was a woman who read the landscape of human events with the same fluency that good ranchers read weather. She came to Louisa's school that afternoon on the pretext of dropping off a donation of slates, and she looked at Louisa's face and said simply, "Well, thank goodness," and hugged her with considerable force. Word moved through the valley the way all words move through Coldwater Valley, through Edna's diner and the general store and the post office and the Sunday services, and the response was, with very few exceptions, some version of what Harriet had said. Edna Marsh told anyone who would listen that she had seen it coming since August. Joseph Cross played an extra song on his fiddle at the next dance out of what he described as personal joy. Robert Dutton shook Gideon's hand and said, "It is good to see you back among the living." And Gideon looked at him for a long moment and said, "Yes," with a simplicity that Robert Dutton told his wife was the most moving thing he had heard in years. There were a few in the valley who had doubts, people who remembered Clara and felt a loyalty to her memory that they expressed as skepticism about what Gideon was doing, and people who thought Louisa was too forward for the fashion of the time, too unguarded, too direct about what she wanted and what she thought. Dale Osgood, who had never forgiven Gideon for the water rights settlement, said something at the feed store that was unkind about a woman arriving alone to a valley and making her intentions plain, and the story of what Hector Baines said back to Dale Osgood became a short legend in Coldwater Crossing for several seasons. Gideon, when he heard about it, went to Osgood directly and said something in private that no one was party to, but after which Dale Osgood made no further public comment on the subject of Louisa Bancroft. December was cold and white and absolutely beautiful, and Gideon and Louisa existed in each other's company with the ease of two people who have spent months learning each other's rhythms, and now have the joy of inhabiting those rhythms openly. He came to her every Friday for supper, and she went to the Double C on Saturday mornings, and they rode the valley together on Sunday afternoons when the weather allowed, which it did not always, but even the days when it did not allow it were fine, because they simply sat by one fire or the other and read, and the silence between them by December was not the silence of two people with nothing to say but the silence of two people who have said enough and are comfortable in the rest. He talked more now. Not constantly. He was not a man of constant speech and never would be. But he had recovered the capacity for it that grief had suppressed, and she listened to him the way good listeners listen, not waiting to respond but actually receiving. And what she received from him was the portrait of a man of considerable intelligence and genuine feeling, a man who had gone underground after catastrophic loss and had slowly, with enormous patience, and without knowing it was happening, found his way back toward the surface. He told her in December, sitting by her fire with snow thick at the windows, that he had not thought it was possible. Not this. He meant all of it, being glad to wake up in the morning, having a person to think about through the day, feeling something when he came up the road toward her cottage that was not yet named but was unmistakably good. "Is it strange?" she asked. "After so long, everything feels like it is happening for the first time," he said. "Which is strange, and also," he paused. "Right," he looked at her. "Does that sound foolish?" "It sounds true," she said. He proposed to her on a Saturday morning in January, in the kitchen of the Double C, with no ceremony whatsoever, which was entirely in character. He had been standing at the window watching the horses in the snow paddock, and she had been slicing bread at the counter, and he turned from the window and looked at her and said, "Marry me, Louisa." She put the bread knife down and turned to look at him. "I mean it," he said. "I want you here, not just on Saturday mornings. Here. This is your house as much as it is mine if you want it to be." He crossed the kitchen and stood before her with his hands at his sides, and his expression was the most open she had ever seen it, stripped of the careful distance he had maintained for decades. "I know I am not easy. I know I come with a great deal of history, and not all of it is simple. But I love you, and I think we would be good. You and I think we could build something worth having." She looked at him for a long, quiet moment, this man who had been closed and was open, who had been silent and had learned to speak, who had not said a kind word in decades and had somehow, since she arrived in this valley, not been able to stop. "Yes," she said. "Of course, yes." He held her face in both his hands and rested his forehead against hers and said, "Thank you," in a voice so quiet it was almost not a voice at all, more like breath taking on the shape of gratitude. "No," she said, holding his wrists. "Thank you for coming back." They were married on a Saturday in March, when the first tentative signs of the Wyoming spring were beginning to show, tiny green at the bases of the fence posts and the creek running fast and cold with snowmelt. The whole valley attended. Reverend Price officiated with evident pleasure. Harriet Dutton cried from beginning to end and did not apologize for it. Joseph Cross played the fiddle at the reception in the Dutton barn until his arm gave out, which took 3 hours. Louisa wore a dress the color of cream, which she and Harriet had made together over 6 Saturday afternoons, and she carried a bunch of dried lavender because nothing fresh was blooming yet. And she walked down the aisle of the little church on Robert Dutton's arm because her own father was too far away to make the journey, though he sent a letter that arrived 4 days before the ceremony, and that she read aloud to Gideon on the porch of the Double C, both of them in the thin March sun. Her father had written, "You always knew what you wanted, Louisa. I never worried about you the way I worried about the others because you always knew your own mind. I think you have done something brave, and I think you are happy, and that is what a father wants. Give my regards to this Gideon McCrae and tell him that he is the luckiest man in Wyoming." Gideon had listened to the letter with his eyes on the mountains, and when she finished reading, he said, "Your father is right." "About which part?" she asked. "All of it," he said. After the wedding, Louisa moved from the school cottage to the Double C, which required a significant number of books to be transported, requiring 2 wagon trips, which the Brent brothers volunteered to make, and which Tommy Hester also appeared for, without being asked, in the way of young men who have decided that someone is worth helping. Gideon built new shelves in the parlor for the books, and Louisa arranged them with the focused pleasure of a person whose library is finally being given the space it deserves. She kept her position at the school. This had been settled between them without difficulty, because Gideon was not a man who believed a woman's purpose ended when her marital status changed, and Louisa had been entirely clear that the school was part of her and would remain so. She rode into town on her roan mare on school mornings and came home in the afternoons, and she brought the work of the school home in the evenings, the papers to grade and the lessons to plan, and Gideon sat across the table from her while she worked and either read or did his own accounts, and the evenings were fine and full. Spring came in properly in April, and the valley went green again, and the lupin came back on the high meadows, and the creek ran with that particular early-season voice that was somewhere between conversation and song. Louisa planted her kitchen garden with twice the ambition of the previous year, because now she had Gideon to help her, and he proved to be a man of considerable competence with a spade, and a genuine if understated interest in what she was growing. She took her students to the beaver dam on the creek in May, as she had planned the previous spring, and Tommy Hester wrote 14 pages about the dam's engineering principles, which Louisa sent to a natural science journal in Denver, and which was published in the summer issue with Tommy's name on it, and which caused Tommy Hester to stand in the middle of the schoolyard and make a sound that was not quite a shout but was headed in that direction. When Louisa told Gideon about it, he smiled. Not the almost smile she had spent the previous year learning to read, but an actual, fully committed smile, the kind that used the whole face, and she felt it hit her somewhere in the center of her chest like a bell being struck. "You did that," he said. "Tommy did that," she said. "You gave him room to," he said. "That is the same thing." She looked at him across the supper table and thought about how much landscape was contained in a single human face, how much had changed in his in a year, and how all of it had been there all along, waiting for the right season. In the summer of 1883, Louisa became pregnant. She knew before she said it to anyone. She had suspected for 3 weeks before she told Gideon, and she waited not because she was afraid of his response, but because she wanted to be certain, wanted to stand on solid ground when she spoke. She told him on a Sunday evening in late July, sitting on the porch of the Double C with the long light going gold over the valley. She simply said, "I am going to have a baby," and then she watched his face. What happened in his face in those seconds was the most complete thing she had ever witnessed in another human being. She saw shock, and then something she could not immediately name, and then she recognized it as fear, the very particular fear of a man who has lost a wife and child to illness and now faces the possibility of joy so large it also contains the possibility of catastrophe. She reached across and took his hand. "I know," she said quietly. "I know what you are afraid of." He was looking at the mountains and his jaw was set and she could feel the tension in his hand under hers. "Louisa," he said. "I cannot," he stopped. "You can," she said. "We both can. And there is every reason to believe it will be fine. I am healthy and I am strong, and Dr. Hennessy is a capable man." Dr. Hennessy had arrived in Coldwater Crossing the previous winter, a young physician from Denver named Calvin Hennessy, who was perhaps 28 years old and was, by the valley's early assessment, both competent and sensible, which was all anyone really needed from a doctor in Wyoming. Gideon turned to look at her. His eyes were dark with something she understood to be the specific grief of a man who has learned that love and loss are not separable, that the same door that opens to one opens to the other. "I am not going to pretend I am not frightened," he said. "Good," she said. "I would rather you be honest about it." "And I am not going to let it stop me from being glad," he said, "because I am enormously glad." She squeezed his hand. He brought it to his lips and kissed her knuckles in a gesture of such simple tenderness that she had to look away for a moment because her eyes were blurring. "We are going to be all right," she said. "Yes," he said. "We are." The pregnancy was neither simple nor complicated. She was tired in the first months in the way that pregnancy tires women who are accustomed to being energetic, and she found it mildly offensive but tolerable. By October she had rallied and was teaching full days again, and managing the garden's fall close, and riding the valley with Gideon on Sunday afternoons, which Harriet Dutton declared was too much, and which Louisa declared was exactly the right amount, and the two of them maintained their respective positions throughout the winter with great good humor. Gideon was attentive in the way that men who have learned to pay attention are attentive, quietly and practically, and without making it a burden. He took over the wood chopping without discussion. He appeared with extra blankets when the nights were coldest. He rode to town himself for whatever the doctor recommended without complaint. He also, she noticed, began talking to her belly in the evenings when he thought she might be asleep, very quietly, the low murmur of it reaching her through the wall of the bedroom, not words she could always make out but a tone, a warm and hesitant and absolutely earnest tone, the tone of a man reintroducing himself to hope. She pretended to be asleep every time and loved him for it extravagantly. The baby came in March of 1884, a year and 1 week after their wedding, on a morning when the snow was melting off the roof in long shining sheets, and the creek below the house was running loud. Harriet Dutton came, and Dr. Hennessy came, and Walt Brent's wife Sarah came, because Sarah had delivered 6 children of her own, and had the calm competence of a woman who knows that birth, like the weather, is something you see through to the end. It was 18 hours, which was long, and there were portions of it that were difficult in ways that required everything Louisa had, but she had a great deal, and she moved through every portion of it with the same quality she brought to everything, steady and present and refusing to let the difficulty define the moment. The baby was born at 3 in the afternoon, a boy. Gideon was in the hallway outside the bedroom door when it happened, because that was where Harriet had placed him, firmly and without appeal at the beginning of proceedings. He heard the cry. He heard it, and he stood very still in the hallway with his hand flat against the wall, and Harriet Dutton opened the door and looked at him and said, "You have a son, Gideon. Come in." He came to the bed and looked at Louisa, and she was tired in the way that people are tired when they have done something enormous, tired all the way through, but her eyes when they found his were entirely clear and entirely joyful. "We are fine," she said before he could speak. "He is fine. We are both fine." He sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the baby, this small furious red person that the doctor put into his arms with a practical ease that Gideon tried to match and almost managed. The baby looked at him with the specific unfocused gaze of the very new, and Gideon looked back, and whatever had happened between them in that first moment of looking was private and complete, and belonged to no language Gideon had ever learned to speak. He held the baby for a long time. Then he looked at Louisa and said, "What do you want to name him?" She had thought about it for months. "James," she said. "James William McCrae, James for your father and William for mine." He looked down at the baby. "James," he said, and then very quietly to the baby, "Hello, James." The valley took to James McCrae immediately, and with the warmth that communities reserve for the children of people they have watched find each other, which is a particular kind of warmth, doubled by the sense of a story well arrived. Harriet Dutton brought a quilt she had made in the 3 months before the birth, blue and white and stitched with extraordinary precision. Joseph Cross brought a carved wooden horse that he had made himself. Tommy Hester, who was 14 now and nearly as tall as Gideon, came with a carefully written card and a look of considerable bashfulness, and Louisa shook his hand gravely and told him he was going to be a great man of science, and he turned red and left at speed. Dr. Hennessy came back to check on Louisa at 3 days, 7 days, and 2 weeks, and at each visit declared both mother and child exactly as they should be, which Gideon received each time with a controlled relief that Louisa could read in the set of his shoulders, the slow loosening of them as the doctor spoke. Spring came again to Coldwater Valley, the 4th spring since Louisa had driven her wagon full of books down the valley road and encountered Gideon McCrae telling her she was on the wrong side of it. She was in the kitchen garden on a warm May morning, James asleep in a basket in the kitchen doorway, the sun full on the mountains, when she heard Gideon come up from the barn and stop at the gate and stand there watching her, and she looked up at him. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said, but he was smiling. That full, committed, face-wide smile that she had first seen the previous May. "You are staring," she said. "I am looking," he said. "There is a difference." She sat back on her heels. "And what are you looking at?" He unlatched the gate and came into the garden and crouched beside her in the dirt, and he picked up her soil-dark hand and held it, and he looked at the mountains for a moment before looking back at her. "At my life," he said. "I am looking at my life." She felt that all the way through, felt it settle into the deepest place in her, the place where the truest things are kept. "It is a good one," she said. "It is the best one," he said. James made his first proper sound of complaint from the kitchen doorway. A sound that was not yet a word but carried the full intention of communication. And they both looked at him, and then at each other. And the laughter they shared in that spring garden was something that neither of them could have named, but both of them recognized immediately as the exact right answer to 23 years of silence. The summer of 1884 brought its particular abundance to Coldwater Valley. The long hot days and the evening thunderstorms and the creek full and noisy, and the cattle fat on summer grass. Louisa taught the school through to July, when the summer break came, and spent her first summer truly free from teaching in 6 years, and found it both delightful and slightly disorienting, and solved the disorientation by developing an ambitious project to organize and expand the school's library using a grant she had written to the territory's education board in May. The grant came through in August, $50, which was more than she had hoped for, and she spent it with the precision of a woman who has been making careful decisions with limited resources her entire adult life. New primers, a set of geography texts, a complete set of natural history volumes that she ordered from a publisher in New York, knowing Tommy Hester would consider them a personal gift. Gideon, watching her unpack the books when they arrived in late September, said, "You are the finest thing that ever came to this valley." She looked up from the packing crate. "That is a significant claim," she said. "Joseph Cros's fiddle is also a notable arrival." "Second finest," he said, without missing a beat. She threw a packing slip at him, and he caught it and grinned, and she thought, "There it is. There is the man who laughed at every dinner table. There he is, 23 years late and entirely present." The second pregnancy came in the spring of 1885, which Louisa greeted with her usual practical orientation, and Gideon greeted with the specific combination of joy and controlled apprehension that she had by now come to expect from him, and to love, because it was the proof that he had given himself permission to care about outcomes again. And giving that permission was for Gideon McCrae a daily act of courage. Dr. Hennessy, who had by this time become something of a fixture in the valley's social life, managing to attend Edna's diner on Tuesday evenings with regularity, and having been known to engage in what Hector Baines called a spirited discussion about medical theory with anyone willing to hold up their end of it, declared Louisa in excellent health, and saw no reason for concern, and delivered this news to Gideon personally, because he had learned in the first year of the Double C's patronage that Gideon received medical information better in direct conversation than through his wife, not because she would soften it, but because Gideon needed to look at the person saying it. James turned 1 in March of 1885. And the valley marked it with the unconscious communal attention it paid to all significant events, with gifts appearing at the Double C and Harriet Dutton producing a cake of impressive ambition, and James himself presiding over the occasion with the royal indifference of a very small person who does not yet know what a birthday is but is aware that today there is cake. Tommy Hester, now 15, brought a book he had saved his earnings to buy, A Natural History of North American Rivers, and gave it to James with grave ceremony and said, "He will not be able to read it for a while yet, Mrs. McCrae, but when he can, I think he will like it." Louisa hugged him, which embarrassed him thoroughly and pleased him in equal measure. The summer of 1885 moved through its heat and gold, and in September, with the aspens beginning their yearly fire on the ridges, Louisa's second child arrived. This time Gideon was calmer, or at least better at the particular kind of calm that is performed for someone else's benefit, which amounts to a different version of the same thing. He stayed in the hallway again at Harriet's firm insistence, and he held James on his knee and told the boy a long, rambling story about the valley in winter, while down the hall, Louisa worked through the second delivery with the same quality she had brought to the first. It was faster this time, 11 hours, and when Harriet Dutton opened the door she was already smiling. "A girl," she said. "A healthy, loud girl, God bless her." Gideon put James on his hip and walked into the room and found Louisa exhausted and bright-eyed, and holding a small wrapped person who was, indeed, already making her opinions known in a clear and carrying voice. "She is going to be formidable," Louisa said. "Clearly," Gideon said. He touched the baby's cheek with one finger very gently. The baby turned toward his touch with the blind certainty of the newborn. "What do we call her?" "Clara," Louisa said. He looked up from the baby to her face. His eyes were very bright. "Are you sure?" he said. "She deserves to have her name continued," Louisa said simply. "And I think you have carried that name long enough in grief. Let it be joy now." He was quiet for a moment that held everything in it. Then he said, "Clara Elizabeth McCrae," he looked at the baby, "after your grandmother and mine." "Yes," Louisa said. He sat beside her on the bed with James still on his hip, and James looked at the baby with the cautious uncertainty of a toddler confronting a new development, and Clara McCrae looked at the middle distance with the indifferent authority of the newly arrived, and Gideon looked at Louisa with something in his face so full and clean and present that she had to press her lips together to hold herself together. "You have given me everything," he said. "We gave each other everything," she said. "That is different." He kissed her temple. James patted the baby's blanket uncertainly and then, apparently satisfied with this gesture, pointed at the window and said something that was not yet a word but was headed toward one. "Yes," Gideon told him with complete seriousness. "Those are the mountains. They have always been there. You will grow up knowing them, and that is a very good fortune." James considered this and then repeated his almost word, apparently satisfied with the explanation. Louisa laughed, and Gideon laughed, and the baby, as if deciding that the situation was acceptable, stopped voicing her objections and settled into the particular dense silence of a sleeping infant. The valley entered its fourth winter since Louisa's arrival, and the Double C entered it as a household of four, which required adjustments and produced a new kind of daily music that was louder and less orderly than what had come before, and enormously, unreasonably fine. Gideon, who had been alone in that house for years beyond counting, navigated the new volume of family life with a kind of wondering absorption, the expression of a man who cannot quite believe the evidence of his own senses and has decided to accept it fully anyway. He got better at kindness by practicing it, which was how everything gets better. He was kind to his children in the direct, practical way of a man who expresses love through action, through the carved wooden toys he made in the evenings, through the patient, repetitive explanations of ranch life that James received from the age he could be set on a fence post, through the gentleness with which he handled Clara, who was from her earliest weeks a person of decided temperament and needed, Louisa observed, a steady hand and not a heavy one. He was kind to the valley in ways that surprised people who had held to their image of old silent McCrae. He offered his south pasture for the valley's communal roundup in 1886, which had been held traditionally on the Dutton land, because the Dutton land had suffered a dry year. He fixed the fence along the road that abutted the school land without being asked, because he had noticed it, and because his wife's school deserved a proper fence. He brought a cord of wood to Joseph Cross in November without explanation, having observed that Joseph's wood supply was low, and that Joseph's pride would make it difficult for him to ask for help. Joseph Cross, when he found the wood stacked by his door, came to Edna's diner and announced to everyone present that Gideon McCrae had left him enough wood to see out 3 winters, and that whoever claimed the man was hard-hearted was a fool. And Edna Marsh said she had been saying that for 2 years and poured Joseph a second cup of coffee at no charge. Louisa taught the school through 1886 and 1887, watching her students grow and change and move on and be replaced by younger ones. And she carried the whole enterprise forward with the same combination of warmth and rigor that had won the Valley's confidence in her first year. The school grew a little, because 2 new families had settled in the Valley and brought children with them, and the school board added a reading corner and a second stove, and Louisa wrote another grant to the Territory Board and received $75 this time, which she spent on mathematics texts and a world globe that caused more excitement in the classroom than she had anticipated. Tommy Hester finished his schooling in the spring of 1887, at 17, and announced that he intended to go to the University of Wyoming, which had opened in Laramie in 1886. He had written to them in the winter, and had been accepted on the basis of his academic record, which was in large part the record that Louisa had helped him build. He came to the Double C to say goodbye, which he did with the contained emotion of a young man who has not yet fully learned to be comfortable with his own feelings, and Louisa gave him the best book she owned, a complete works of Darwin, and Gideon gave him a piece of advice that Louisa overheard from the kitchen. Gideon said, "The world will try to tell you that what you love is not practical. Do not listen to it. Practical and true are not the same thing." Tommy shook his hand and left, and Louisa came to the parlor doorway and found Gideon still looking at the road. "That was well said," she told him. "It is what someone should have said to me," he said, 40 years ago. "You found your way regardless," she said. "Eventually," he said. He turned and found her in the doorway, and his face did the thing it did that she had never stopped being moved by, the opening, the readiness, the look of a man who is glad to look at who is standing there. With considerable help. She crossed the room and took his arm, and they stood together at the window looking out at the May Valley, the green running up the ridges and the creek silver in the afternoon, James playing in the yard below with a wooden horse that had no tail because Clara had pulled it off, and Clara sitting on the fence post being kept company by Walt Brent's youngest daughter, and the whole abundant mess of a life being lived outdoors in the Wyoming spring. "Did you know," Louisa said, "that when I drove into this valley 3 years ago with all my books and not much else, I thought, if I can make something real here, something true, something that belongs to this place as much as it belongs to me, then everything will have been worth it." And, he said, she leaned her head against his shoulder, "And everything has been worth it," she said, 10 times over. He put his arm around her and held her against his side, and they watched their children below in the afternoon, and the mountains watched them back from their permanent position of magnificent indifference to all human activity, and the creek ran cold and continuous as it always had, and would, long after all of them were gone. In August of 1887, Reverend Price held a community dinner in the church yard, as he did every year on the anniversary of the town's founding, and the whole of Coldwater Crossing attended, which was by now a community of some 40 families, grown from the 11 ranches of 1882. The dinner was long and loud and full of the specific pleasure of a place that knows itself well enough to enjoy its own company, and the fiddle was played by Joseph Cross until his arm gave out again, at which point his 14-year-old nephew, who had come to spend the summer, took over and proved to be, if possible, even better. Gideon McCrae sat at the table in the churchyard between Louisa and Robert Dutton, with James asleep against his arm, and Clara on Louisa's lap eating cornbread, with the focused enthusiasm of a 2-year-old who has recently discovered that cornbread is the best thing in the world. And he looked around at the gathered people of the valley in the August evening light, and felt something he would not have been able to name 5 years ago, because he had believed it had been permanently taken from him. He felt that he belonged here. that these were his people, and he was theirs, and that the thing he had spent 23 years without, the ordinary, irreplaceable warmth of community and love and the knowledge that you are known and kept by the people around you, was restored to him in full. Louisa was talking to Harriet Dutton about something, and she caught his eye across the table and gave him the look she gave him sometimes when they were in company, a private look, coded to him alone. That meant "I see you." He held it for a moment, and then she turned back to Harriet and he looked back at Robert Dutton, and the evening went on. After walking home under the stars with James asleep over Gideon's shoulder and Clara walking between them with one hand in each of theirs, Louisa said, "What were you thinking about? At the table, you had a look." "I was thinking," he said, "that I used to be a different person in this valley." "You were not a different person," she said. "You were the same person in a great deal of pain." "Perhaps," he said. "Not perhaps," she said. The man who had an arrangement with the beavers about his pasture was never a cold man. He was a man who had put his warmth somewhere safe and was waiting, without knowing it, for it to be needed again. He thought about that in the way he thought about everything she said, completely without hurrying to respond. "You needed it," he said finally. "I did," she said. "I still do." "You have it," he said. "All of it, everything I have." Above them, the Wyoming sky performed its particular August abundance, more stars than a person from a city could believe possible, spread across the dark from horizon to horizon with the unconcerned generosity of something that has been doing this long enough not to need acknowledgement for it. Clara said, "Stars," in the decisive way of someone naming an important thing. "Yes," Louisa said. "Stars." "Stars," Clara said again, pointing up. "All yours," Gideon told her. He looked up himself for a moment. Then down at the road ahead, the cottage visible at the end of it with the lamp Louisa had left burning in the window. "All of it. All yours." They came home through the dark valley and put the children to bed, James in his room with his wooden horse restored to its proper place beside his pillow, Clara in her crib with the blue and white quilt Harriet Dutton had made, which she refused to sleep without. And then Gideon and Louisa sat together on the porch of the Double C in the late summer night, as they had done through all the seasons since their marriage, as they would do through all the seasons remaining to them, two people entirely and specifically themselves in the place that had become entirely and specifically theirs. The creek ran below in the dark, and the mountains held their silence, and somewhere up on the ridge a single coyote called and was answered. "Are you happy?" she asked him. She asked it every so often, not out of doubt but out of genuine interest, the way a person who loves someone continues to want to know what is true for them. He turned to look at her in the porch dark, this woman with her red hair loose around her shoulders and her dark eyes steady on his, who had driven a wagon into this valley with all her books and all her courage, and had walked straight toward him without flinching. "More than I believed I would ever be again," he said. "More than I knew it was possible to be." She reached across and put her hand over his, and he turned his hand and held hers, and they sat together in the Wyoming night with the summer cooling around them and the stars burning overhead. And the valley held them the way it had always held everything that belonged to it, the creek and the mountains and the grass and the wild lupin, and all the long years of ordinary and extraordinary days, with the particular faithfulness of a place that does not ask to be thanked for what it gives, but gives nonetheless, season after season, year after year, the same clear valley and the same blue sky, new every morning. Gideon McCrae had not said a kind word in decades. Then Louisa Bancroft moved to the valley, and something in him had opened that he had not expected to ever open again, and the words had come, and the laughter had come, and the life had come back into him like water into ground that has been dry too long and has forgotten, until the first rain, that it was ever capable of anything growing. He could not seem to stop. He did not want to. And all the years ahead of them, all the springs the lupin would come back to the high meadow, and all the summers the creek would run cold and loud, and all the winters the snow would press quiet and white against the windows of the house Clara had chosen the windows for and Louisa had made a home of. All of those years were a door standing open, and he walked through it every morning with his hand in hers. And the valley kept them both. And it was enough, more than enough. It was everything.